Good morning, it is 7 o'clock and this is Sky News Breakfast. These are our top stories this morning. £3 billion of investment into skills and education for what the Chancellor is calling a skills revolution.
We've had 2 people accidentally shot on a movie set by a prop gun. We need help immediately.
The 911 call revealing the shock and confusion after a crew member was shot dead on Alec Baldwin's film set. Roll up your sleeves. More people are urged to get vaccinated as a way out of the pandemic, as cheaper COVID tests are introduced for travellers. A new pilot scheme in the UK is to use genome sequencing on 100,000 newborn babies to detect rare diseases. A crisis on the buses, with a shortage of at least 4,000 drivers nationwide as staff leave to become lorry drivers. The weather, mild but windy, with showers for most, but the southeast will be fine into the evening. And at 7:45, we'll take a look through the morning's papers with writer Benedict Spence and broadcaster Gemma Forte. Good morning, thanks very much for joining us here on Breakfast. £3 billion is set to be pumped into the education system for post-16-year-olds to boost skills for young people entering the workforce. Chancellor Rishi Sunak is expected to make the announcement in Wednesday's budget. There'll be new traineeships, extra classroom hours available and new cash to revitalise existing colleges in what Mr Sunak is calling a skills revolution. It's one of a raft of budget announcements released by the Treasury overnight, as our political correspondent Rob Powell reports.
Skilling up to secure jobs. £3 billion is expected in the budget to help young people after they leave school and those changing careers. Last summer, Sky News spoke to Chris from Lancashire. After leaving his job just before the first lockdown, he was struggling to find another.
We want to work. We'll do anything. It doesn't matter if we're stacking shelves or if we're running companies.
The jobs aren't out there.
The jobs just aren't there at the moment.
I got really lucky.
After 8 months and 200 job applications, Chris did eventually find a role, but says being able to reskill would have helped him.
I would have retrained. I would have reskilled. I would have done anything to get back into the job market again. For the first time in a very long time, we have more job vacancies than we have people out of work. But again, it's if everyone is trained to be a farmer and you want a brain surgeon, that vacancy is always going to be there.
It's people like Chris that could be helped through £3 billion for adult reskilling, as well as teenage year courses and college revamps. Elsewhere, £1.5 billion will be spent to help bring in overseas investment and foreign talent. £700 million will be spent on the post-Brexit borders system and a fleet of new maritime patrol vessels, and over £400 million will go on victims' services, crime prevention and prosecutions. Education leaders have welcomed the skills cash, but economists say the tangible impact may be more limited.
Most of the extra funding for adult education and skills spending is kind of reversing some of the cuts, and some of the quite big cuts have happened to funding over the last decade. We've seen, for instance, the government has announced extra funding for adults to get A-level equivalent qualifications, which is funding that was already available up until about 10 years ago.
The Treasury has another tricky balancing act to this budget. On the one hand, sustain the nation's recovery and make good on promises to level up. On the other, a desire to manage the country's finances responsibly and demonstrate traditional Conservative low-tax credentials. And if that wasn't enough of a challenge for the Chancellor, he also has the other government departments' spending to set. Rishi Sunak has said he'll do whatever it takes to support families and ease the cost of living over the coming months. But with many competing political and economic pressures, it's hard to imagine that everyone will end up getting what they want. Rob Powell, Sky News in Westminster.
Well, let's get more on that announcement by the government of £3 billion into education as part of the budget this week. The money is expected to be directed, as we've heard, towards post-16 education, as well as later in life adult learning. Joining me now is the Chief Executive and Principal at Bridgewater and Taunton Further Education College, Andy Berry. Andy, good morning to you. How and where do you think this money should be spent?
Well, we've all seen and been following with great interest the challenges in the supply chain to our shops and our supermarkets. But the businesses that I speak to are really struggling to find appropriately skilled people to fill their vacancies. So I think this funding needs to be targeted as flexibly as possible so that we as educational organisations can work with employers, understand their needs, understand their vacancies, and support your viewers to secure the skills they need to secure those jobs.
The largest chunk of the money is going to the post-16, 16 to 19-year-olds, and an aim to see a rapid escalation in the numbers on T-levels. Now, for those who haven't heard of them, what is a T-level?
A T-level's a fantastic new initiative. We'll immediately understand what an A-level is. Well, the T-level is the technical equivalent of an A-level. So at the same academic standard, but brilliantly, T-levels incorporate a placement within an employer. So you can get that skills, those experience, along with the knowledge at the same point. But importantly, at the same standard as an A-level. So an example we've become the first FE college in the country to deliver nursing degrees. And so our T-level students in health get a chance to spend some time within the NHS and then progress on to perhaps a degree apprenticeship.
There has been concern, though, hasn't it, that T-levels are coming at the expense of the BTECs, which were described as the engines of social mobility, and that some were going to lose out.
Yeah, I think that's a really important concern. T-levels are, unlikely to be right for every sector of the economy. And so immediately my mind would be big industries around the creative arts and performing arts and sport and others. It's probably less likely that public emergency services would be another great example. You can imagine it's much harder to get that placement element. So the BTECs and applied general qualifications still have a really important role to play. But I think, for the right sectors in the right place, the T-levels really help raise the standard of that technical education.
The coronavirus pandemic has changed the employment landscape in this country. What about the focus on adults and reskilling, being able to retrain for different careers?
Yeah, I think it's essential really in the sort of post-COVID world as we begin to build our economy back. And of course, let's not forget the implications of Brexit as well and the challenges that brings. This type of investment in skills is absolutely essential for our economy. I think perhaps too often we think of education and think of schools, and we think of skills and think of universities. Well, in fact, the further education colleges are kind of the engine room of our economy and provide access to those skills through your local college to enable adults in our communities to get the skills they require to secure that all-important employment.
How far does this money go then? How big a difference will it make, Andy?
We've had a really tough few years. The austerity has bitten further education, the sector really, really hard. This money is so welcome. It's amazing to be on Sky Breakfast this morning talking about further education colleges, So it will help begin to redress many years of underfunding. I mean, what I'm really interested to see this week as to whether there'll be extra funds for 16-year-olds to catch up. It's really important, those young people that have been massively affected by COVID-19, that when they come to college, we can support them to catch up. Again, it's important for our adults, but it's just it's just a start. So I'll be watching really interestingly the budget this week. Let's hope for much more to follow and hope this is just an initial sort of trail of the great news for our skills and our further education colleges this week.
So a positive first step for you. Andy Berry, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Breakfast this morning.
My pleasure.
On The Great Debate tomorrow night, we will be discussing the cost of living and asking what's got to give, with almost all aspects of life getting more expensive. And the Chancellor set to deliver his budget on Wednesday. We want your stories and your questions for our panel of experts. Email thegreatdebate@sky.uk to join our virtual audience and tune in at 9 p.m. tomorrow. And Trevor Phillips will be joined by the Chancellor Rishi Sunak this morning. He'll also be speaking to Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves and Professor Adam Finn, who sits on the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. That is at 8:30 this morning. The 911 call from a member of the crew reporting the shooting on the set of Rust has been released, giving a sense of the panic and confusion in the moments after it happened. Even as the investigation into the accident involving Alec Baldwin continues, other productions are already changing the way they use guns, real or props. Our US correspondent Greg Milam reports from Los Angeles.
Some of the finest moments in Hollywood history were captured at the Bonanza Creek Ranch. It will now be forever associated with one of the movie industry's most tragic.
We've had 2 people accidentally shot on a movie set by a prop gun. We need help immediately.
So was it loaded with a real bullet or one?
I cannot tell you that.
We now know a lot more about the incident that led to the death of cinematographer Helena Hutchins, killed by a single shot fired by the actor Alec Baldwin. He and the crew member who'd handed him the gun, unaware it was loaded with live rounds. The armourer on set, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, in a podcast after her last movie, had talked about the intensity of the job.
It was also my first time being head armor as well.
And how was that?
You know, I was really nervous about it at first, and I almost didn't take the job because I wasn't sure if I was ready, but doing it, it went really smoothly. I think loading blanks was, the scariest thing to me.
Police say their investigation continues. No one has been arrested or charged. The tributes continue for Helena Hutchins, her husband Matt, posting a photo of her with their son. She inspired us all with her passion and vision, he wrote. Her legacy is too meaningful to encapsulate in words. Those who worked with her wonder whether her death will lead to prop guns being banned on set.
Today I'm saying yes. I mean, there's an aesthetic argument one can make about it, whether or not it looks, as good. But today I think I definitely feel like I'm questioning those kinds of things. This is made me think very differently.
But if you think you can succeed where they fail.
Already the makers of this police drama have responded by banning what they call live guns from their set. From now on they'll use pellet guns and special effects. Those who've spent their career on set say that should be just the start.
I hope that this will be an agent for change, because there's really no reason, there never should be someone who dies making a film. I think that it'll definitely be looked at, and there are ways that you can mitigate the risk by doing it in post-production, by changing the shooting angle.
At a vigil in New Mexico, Helena Hutchins was remembered, so too the impact of her death.
Every person deserves to go to work with complete security, knowing they can perform their work and return home safely. This moment has shaken all of us to the very core.
There are still so many questions over an incident that to many was unthinkable, one that's left an industry in shock and a family grieving a loss they describe as enormous. Greg Milam, Sky News, Los Angeles.
Labour is urging the government to immediately scrap VAT on energy bills to prevent the cost of living crisis worsening this winter. The party says cutting VAT on domestic energy bills from 5% to 0% should come into place as soon as November and remain for 6 months. Colombian armed forces have captured the country's most wanted drug trafficker. Dairo Antonio Usuga, known by the alias Antoniel, is accused of killing police officers and recruiting and sexually abusing children. The US government had been offering a $5 million reward for his capture. Colombia's president described the arrest as the biggest blow to drug trafficking in the country since the death of Pablo Escobar in the 1990s. One of Ecuador's most successful athletes, sprinter Alex Quinones, has been shot dead. Quinones, who was 32, was the first Ecuadorian to win a global medal in a track event, taking bronze in the 2019 World Championships. He was shot dead in the street in the port city of Guayaquil. Breaking news this morning from Taiwan, where a magnitude 6.2 earthquake has struck in the northern region near Yilan. The European Mediterranean Seismological Centre said the quake was at a depth of 40 kilometres, that is 25 miles. We'll bring you more details as we get them throughout the morning here. Now, from today, fully vaccinated travellers arriving in England from non-red list countries will be able to take a cheaper lateral flow test on or before day 2 of their arrival, instead of the more expensive PCR tests. It's been described as a huge boost to the travel industry. So how does it work? Well, travellers must take a photo of their test and booking reference, which they'll need to send back to the test provider to verify the result. Passengers can also pre-book a test to have on their arrival at some airport testing centres. Those who test positive will receive a free PCR test to verify the result. However, a 10-day hotel quarantine remains in place for those 7 red list countries, regardless of vaccination status. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson has issued a call to arms, urging everyone to get vaccinated against COVID-19. It follows rising infection levels and concerns that new restrictions may have to be introduced unless numbers go down. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has said cases could go up to 100,000 a day. But some experts are calling for an immediate return to working from home and the mandatory use of face masks. In his statement, Mr Johnson says this is a call to everyone, whether you're eligible for a booster, haven't got round to your second dose yet, or your child is eligible for a dose. Vaccines are safe, they save lives, and they are our way out of this pandemic. A new pilot scheme is to use genome sequencing on 100,000 newborn babies to detect rare diseases. It's part of a £5 billion package of investment into projects to tackle the UK's biggest health threats, expected to be announced in the budget. Milena Veselinovic is in the newsroom for us. Milena, what can you tell us about this plan?
Well, at the moment, existing tests can identify 9 conditions, but as part of this project and with new technology, doctors will be able to detect over 200 rare diseases. Now, this has the potential to save as many as 3,000 babies a year. And a genome really is a complete map of a person's genetic codes. It contains lots of valuable information about a person's health. So considering that Genomics England says that over 80% of all severe and rare diseases contain a genetic component, when you have a newborn genome sequenced, it could enable doctors to catch certain conditions early and treat them early, and it's especially important with those where treatment is actually more effective before symptoms actually occur. Now, some of this £5 billion investment will also be directed to tackling health inequalities and in particular to increase representation of people from diverse backgrounds in genomic research projects. There'll be an aim of recruiting at least 15% of people from ethnic minority backgrounds for these types of projects, and that is particularly important to make sure that they're not disadvantaged by not having enough accurate information or uncertain information about health conditions that may plague them.
Milena, thank you. There's a shortage of at least 4,000 bus and coach drivers in the country, with many companies blaming HGV bosses for poaching their drivers. The situation's become so serious that services are being cut and suspended in many areas because there simply aren't enough drivers to keep buses on the road. Becky Johnson reports.
They're trying to keep things moving, but it's not always possible. This bus company in the East Midlands has lost 10% of its drivers, and across the country there's a shortage of more than 4,000 bus drivers, many tempted away by big salaries on offer to drive HGVs instead.
The mindset of the bus drivers at the moment is that over in the haulage industry, the employers threw money at the problem, at the shortage. So the mindset is now, we might as well do it for £20 an hour driving a lorry as £10 an hour driving a bus.
A shortage of drivers means fewer buses can run. The cancellation's a problem for those with no other way to get around.
I need 2 buses to run on time to get to work, yeah. It's quite inconvenient if my next bus gets knocked off the service because I go up and work at a warehouse. But I feel for the older people who can't walk into town.
You can't get to the hospital if you haven't got transport.
It's having an impact on a daily basis at the moment.
The bus companies know their customers aren't happy.
We can't compete with the logistics and distribution sector at this moment in time.
Couldn't you just pay drivers more?
It's difficult to do more than we have because other cost pressures are also going up. So fuel, for example, is costing us £100,000 more so far in 2021 than it did in 2020 because the price of fuel is escalating.
The Department for Transport say they're working closely with the bus sector over workforce issues. All passengers can do is wait, worry and wonder if they'll get where they need to go. Becky Johnson, Sky News, Derbyshire.
Good morning. It is a little after 7:30. You are watching Sky News Breakfast. An update now on the breaking news we brought you earlier from Taiwan, where a magnitude 6.5 earthquake has struck. Buildings shook in Taipei, but there were no reports of damage. It could be felt across the northern and eastern parts of Taiwan, with the epicentre in Yilan County. £3 billion is set to be pumped into the education system for post-16-year-olds to boost skills for young people entering the workforce. There'll be new traineeships, extra classroom hours available and new cash to revitalise existing colleges in what the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, calls a skills revolution. I'm joined now by Jeff Barton, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. Jeff Barton, good morning to you.
Morning,
How big a skills revolution will this allow to happen?
Well, I think that's a good question. Time will tell whether this is truly a revolution. But nevertheless, we know that post-16 education, FE in particular, from independent sources, has been, since 2010, starved of funding. So it's good to hear the Chancellor recognising that if we're genuinely going to do something around this phrase, levelling up, then the need for appropriate skills is going to be particularly important. I think it's a bit of a gamble in one sense, because I think probably, Sarah, if you were to say to your viewers, what do you know about T-levels? Lots of them would find that a harder question than what do you know about A-levels, what do you know about GCSEs, what do you know about apprenticeships, for example. And the reason for that is that T-levels have only been in existence for 1 year. So no young person has yet got a qualification called a T-level. And the government just needs to be a bit careful, I think, about overstating things with an untried, untested qualification, which ultimately is going to be down to young people to think, well, do I want to do that instead of something I'm more familiar with, A-levels, BTECs, Cambridge Nationals, apprenticeships. So it's not just about the funding, it's also about making sure those courses are really doing what they are promising to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I had to look up the detail of T-levels this morning. And at the moment, there are only some 2,000 students taking them, aren't there? But this is going to see it upscaled in a big way.
That's the idea of it. I mean, it's worth just reminding ourselves that you've got something like 900,000 young people who are doing post-16 education one way or another. A third of those, we reckon, are doing BTEC. So a BTEC allows you to do that vocational qualification. They're well respected by employers. And for a lot of young people, particularly in disadvantaged communities, they have been a stepping stone for them then to go into higher level apprenticeships or into higher education degree courses. And the government at the same time is talking about the new T-levels, which, as you say, have only got 1,500 to 2,000 youngsters doing them. At the same time they talk about that, they're also talking about scrapping many of those BTECs. They need to be careful about that, because with 300,000 young people doing those BTECs, they're going to feel cut adrift. And it's just worth saying this, Sarah, I think, that until the age of 16, we have a curriculum that won't talk about skills. It talks only about knowledge. It says that certain subjects are far more important than other ones. Now, if you're going to ask me as a 16-year-old to choose a course that I might not have heard of, studying one subject in the way that A-levels and BTECs would allow me to have a range of subjects, and to do 45 days of work experience if we can find the employers who are going to provide that, that's quite a big ask. And I think that one of the things the government should be looking at is making sure that we give skills education more emphasis pre-16. So you've got young people deciding, I want to do T-levels because I've started to have some of that technical experience before I finally get my GCSEs and other qualifications at age 16, if that makes sense.
And Jeff, I wonder, before we leave you, if I can just ask you one thing about the vaccine rollout for school-age children, secondary school children. It has been reported today that the Education Secretary, Nadhim Zahawi, is going to write directly to 12 to 15-year-olds, urging them to get a COVID vaccine, bypassing their parents. Would you support this, and would it help give a boost to what has been a sluggish rollout in this group so far?
I certainly think just conveying to young people directly why this matters, why, one of the great achievements of humanity have been vaccinations, haven't they, is a good idea. That's not to say that many of their parents aren't absolutely supporting them and ultimately will be giving consent. So if what that's about is increasing the amplification of why this matters, so be it. But I have to say, Sarah, there's quite a lot of young people who were queuing up to have their vaccination, last week in school, and the team that was supposed to be doing the vaccination either didn't turn up or didn't have enough of the vaccine. We have to get this right, because I don't think it is just that there is a reluctance. Look at Scotland, for example, 40% of young people compared to our 12% in England. I don't think this is just about reluctance. I think the logistics have been, frankly, in too many cases, not all, somewhat disappointing.
OK, Jeff Barton, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
175 cyclists are setting off from London this morning. Their destination, Glasgow, and the COP26 climate conference. None are professional cyclists, but all are passionate about climate change. Joining me now is Patrick Yu, who's involved with Ride the Change. Patrick, morning to you. Wow, you've got quite a journey ahead of you.
Yes, indeed, but it all starts here. Yeah, we're delighted it's all come together. We had a crowdfunder to see if the ride could actually happen, but we at Possible Do Nation and Arab, put this out there, and there was massive interest, and we were sort of overwhelmed by the enthusiasm for doing a ride in late October up to Glasgow. But yeah, there you go, 175.
So 175 people cycling 475 miles. What's the aim? What are the goals you want to achieve along the way?
Well, it's a fun and social way to sort of highlight the climate solutions that are out there and inspire climate action. So, for example, everyone is not getting sponsored to raise money, but to raise actions. So they've gone out to their mates using our platform via Donation, and they've said to their mates, rather than give me a £5, why don't you pledge to change your energy supplier, or eat less meat, or pledge to not fly for a year? So literally, we're aiming to do 5,000 of these actions, and you can highlight the carbon saved. And hopefully it gets people talking. So today we're cycling to Oxford, there'll be talks in the evening, we'll have a lunch stop, and it's all about getting that peer-to-peer impact and inspiring other people to increase their climate action, but also to increase their local councillors and their local MPs to increase theirs.
It's interesting then, so as we're focusing on COP26 and what global leaders are or are not committing, actually what you're doing is looking at what we can do as individuals to make a difference.
Yeah, it's clearly a bit of both. I mean, we believe that it's all about making this a mass movement, and we want the public to get involved, and with the public involved, sort of politicians, corporate organisations will be forced to take greater action. So for us at Possible, it's a bit of both. It's individual, but it's also the sort of systemic.
So who has got involved? What kind of people are taking part then, Patrick?
Good question. You did highlight that we are all amateur cyclists. So, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there are some days up to 90 miles. But, yeah, it's a group. We've got some that have been the youth climate strikes. We've got some that work maybe in Lego and sustainability. It's a lot from the corporate sector and sustainability, but a lot are just sort of, really keen people that are ambassadors for climate action in their communities. We've got a breadth of sort of people from around the country. But yeah, all coming together. But this is it. I've not met, not many of these 175. So part of the ride is finding out what different communities are doing, what different people in different companies are doing, how they're creating and inspiring greater action where they live. So one aim of the ride is for people to, literally just sort of increase this community and empower these sort of champions for climate action.
Yeah, and hopefully empower your legs along the way for that ride, Patrick. If people are watching this and feeling inspired by what you've had to say, how can they get involved? How can they support what you're doing?
Yeah, so if you go to our social handles, wearepossible.org, and obviously our ride deliverers at donation.com and adventureuncover.com, there'll be information on the ride, but there's going to be a lot on socials. But if you go to wearepossible.org, you'll find information there.
Patrick Yu, thanks very much indeed, and the very best of luck to you and all of those cyclists.
Cheers, thanks a lot.
Welcome back to Sky News Breakfast. Hello, if you're just joining us, we are going to take a look through the Sunday papers now with the writer Benedict Spence and broadcaster Gemma Forte. Morning again to both of you. Benedict, we're starting with the Sunday Telegraph. Again, another paper looking at what the Chancellor will be announcing in the budget on Wednesday. Billions of pounds to digitise the NHS? I sort of feel like we've been here before.
Do you really? Surely not. This is the story that 5 billion is set to be allocated to bringing NHS sort of records and online systems up to speed after it was revealed that there are some that still work on paper systems. But this is actually just a drop in the ocean when you consider that there's also going to be 4 billion allocated to building new hospitals or hospital wings, and up to 12 billion just to maintain hospital facilities. You add to that the 36 billion that's already been allocated to sort of clear the backlogs that have been caused not just as a result of COVID, but in general in the health service. It's quite clear, therefore, that it makes sense on the back of a pandemic that the healthcare service is going to be sort of at the forefront of the government's agenda. But the numbers that are being talked about here are it's unsustainable is the problem. And the Telegraph does also mention that Sajid Javid, the health secretary, has been tasked with massive overhaul of the system. One anonymous source said that he had to get a grip of the NHS, and one can't help but agree. Actually, the population is aging, it's not getting any healthier, and this is just going to continue to be a massive weight on the public purse. And ultimately, we can't continue to keep footing these bills, especially, I'm afraid, if the economy is going to be sort of perpetually at risk of being plunged into a deep freeze because of all kinds of measures to curb the spread of certain diseases. Ultimately, there does need to be reform in the NHS. We cannot just continue to increase its budget infinitely, which ultimately means more taxes on other walks of life.
Well, the urgency of what Sajid Javid having to do as well, Benedict, because the proceeds of the health and social care levy going into the NHS is a boost for now, but the aim is to get them into social care, which we know is desperately in need in the next 3 years. Let's turn to the Observer and many of the papers with more reflections from the set of Rust, the film, Alec Baldwin's film, Gemma, at which a crew member, the cinematographer Helena Hutchins, was fatally shot. And alarm bells were ringing before this incident, according to the Observer.
That's right. And this is one of those stories, I think, when everybody first heard about it, that you just couldn't possibly have ever imagined that you'd be reading. And yes, that's correct. This piece in the Observer does go into more detail about how there had been text messages from various crew members saying that they didn't feel particularly safe. It had been a production that seemed to be mired in quite a lot of chaos. There had been some walkouts as well. And they were only days into a 3-week shoot when this absolute tragedy occurred. You can only imagine how traumatic it must be for everybody concerned. The Joel Souza director has also been shot, but of course this lady, the director of photography, only 42 years old, a mother, a partner to somebody, has lost her life just at work doing her job behind the camera. So I immediately thought, why is there any necessity to have any live ammunition on a film set? Apparently it's to make things more authentic. Seems ridiculous to me, and I'm sure that going forward now the whole of the film industry will be looking at tightening all of this up so that it never happens again.
Yeah, we're already seeing evidence of some programmes changing their policies, using pellet guns, special effects, for example. And we heard that extraordinary podcast clip from the head armourer on the set, from talking about her previous job, where it was the first time she'd been in that role and she wasn't sure that she was qualified for it.
I know. And this is going to be played and played. It's very haunting in light of what's happened. And as you say, she was sort of saying that she didn't necessarily feel experienced enough to take on the role, but that she was going to give it a go. She came from a family who'd been doing this as a job. But of course, you listen to those words now in light of what's happened, and it's horribly eerie. And of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but should she have ever had that job in the first place? Awful.
To the Times, Benedict, and it is looking at COP26 and what is to come, and of course, whether Xi Jinping is going to play any part at all.
This is, of course, the key question, because without China getting on board with the efforts to reach net zero, you might as well not bother, frankly, given that China now burns half of the world's coal. Climate change doesn't, it doesn't just affect us in the West. It affects China as well. A lot that's happening in sort of global slowdown in supply chains and the energy fuel cost crisis has a lot to do with China. It's not particularly dealing well with, everybody who pays any attention to it will know what's going on in the Yangtze Delta and, how much coal is costs to burn in China right now. But one needs to remember ultimately that the Communist Party does not see things necessarily through the lens of what's best for humanity. It sees things through the lens of what's best for the Communist Party, for Beijing, and it will look at net zero and the amount of money that a lot of Western nations are spending on moving from, it must be said, dirty but much more efficient energy sources to much more expensive, cleaner, and much less efficient energy sources. And it will see this as an opportunity, basically as another power grab, to move itself closer to the position of being the global leader, rather than second fiddle to the United States or having to compete with the EU. It's also worth noting, of course, that by doing this, by not looking to cut back too much on fossil fuels, it also drags countries that rely on fossil fuel production closer into its orbit. So that's all of the OPEC countries, that's other countries as well, including Russia, that's including a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. One needs to look at that, I'm afraid, in terms of the broader sort of geopolitical picture and see that ultimately it's not necessarily in China's short-term interest to sign up for everything that the West is doing. And that is, I'm afraid, going to put it at serious risk of not working.
OK, to The Independent, Gemma, the great half-term getaway didn't get off to a great start at Heathrow yesterday. What happened?
Well, the words were uttered that I certainly wouldn't want to hear if I was travelling, which was put essential items in your hand luggage instead, because your bags may not arrive at their destination. So imagine that. You've carefully packed, you've gone through all the admin involved, especially with travelling at the moment, and then chaos because they had a technical issue at Terminal 5 at Heathrow. So apparently absolute chaos ensued. And passengers were forced to queue, leave their luggage, rummaging through their bags, trying to determine what they definitely needed and what they could stuff in their hand luggage. I would absolutely hate this situation. I like taking lots of luggage, and I would be very stressed, I think, trying to determine underwear, I don't know, shoes, what do you take?
Yeah, what are
and
your
then,
essentials?
What can you take in your hand luggage as well?
It's always that awful moment as well, isn't it, when you're at baggage reclaim and you're waiting and waiting and everyone else is disappearing and then you realise there's no bags left, yours haven't made it. But at least people are being able to get away now for half-term. To The Times, Benedict now, and a story on bears. What is it?
The Times calls this a plague of bears, which, in the grand pantheon of our post-biblical plagues after COVID, perhaps seems a little bit, dramatic. But I quite like this story. It's in Transylvania, in Romania. Large bear-like creatures, most likely bears, have wandered down from the hills and are roaming through towns in search of food or perhaps employment. Supposedly, this stems from a 2016 ban in Romania on the hunting of bears, on the shooting of bears. And as a result, the standard number of calls to police for bear-related incidents in 2016 was about 200 a year. In the first 6 months of this year, there have been over 1,500 incidents of people calling the police on bears that have been found in schools, in restaurants, in back gardens. There is a sad element to this as well. People have been killed by bears whilst out for their morning runs. And the issue is now, what is to be done? Because a lot of local people are taking matters into their own hands. They're trying to trap the bears. They're trying to shoot the bears. They're trying to poison the bears. But, Romania, Transylvania, the Carpathian Mountains in particular, has Europe's largest population of bears, over 6,000 at the last count. And these are not necessarily the easiest things to kill. They're apex predators. They're 400 kilograms. They move at 30 miles an hour, and they can climb trees. From out of the frying pan of COVID and into the fire of the bear plague, I think is the way to look at this.
And the quote highlighted that stands out to me: living with bears in your house is not normal, stating the obvious. Benedict and Gemma, thank you both very much indeed for taking us through some of the stories in Sunday's papers. More coming up next on Sky News Breakfast.